I'm Sari.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Welcome back to Seamwork Radio, where we share practical ideas for building a creative process so you can sew with intention and joy. And today we're talking about how to find inspiration in vintage clothing and translate it to a modern wardrobe. So we're going to cover where to look for vintage inspiration, a few of our favorite sources, and how to use that inspiration and not just collect it. So what is your favorite vintage find in the last couple years, Haley?
Man, I think in the last couple years, I've definitely collected more like home good vintage than clothing vintage. But the two clothing items that come to mind are I bought this secondhand, it was probably early 80s or late 70s blazer that someone had indigo dyed, like over dyed. And it's really cute. It's unlined. It's made from cotton. It's very wearable, kind of an everyday thing. And I like that it has this kind of a DIY element to it. Every time I wear it, I get a lot of compliments. And then I also have a silk scarf that I found for $1 that has horses on it.
Oh, I love a horse scarf.
It's great. I love it. I'm not like a horse girl or anything, but the colors are really nice. So when I like tie it up like on my neck or in my hair, you can't really tell that it's horses necessarily, but I know that there's horses on it. So I'm a fan. What about you? What's your favorite vintage find recently?
I think for me, the one that comes to mind is this past winter, I found this faux fur coat on Etsy, and it was pretty inexpensive. I have been wearing it a lot because it's super, super warm and it looks kind of glamorous at the same time. And I just love things that look fancy but are actually really practical and comfortable. So I'm really excited about it. The only thing about it that is not so perfect is it has cropped like bracelet length sleeves. So that makes it a little bit less warm. So I was thinking about maybe next winter making a faux fur jacket that is exactly what I want. So that's kind of high on my list of things to make next year.
Maybe you just need some extra long gloves.
Yeah, I thought about buying some long black gloves, but they don't seem too practical because, I don't know, if you're not wearing a cropped sleeve thing, it seems hard to get them on and off.
Totally. I just like the excuse it offers to wear a long...
like an opera glove.
Why not?
Yeah. So, yeah, it's just a really pretty coat. It's like a cream color, so it almost looks like faux shearling or something like that. I really want to make something like that next year. That's one way vintage stuff has been inspiring me lately. So sometimes it's the things that are in your own closet. And we are going to talk a lot about vintage inspiration today. But in the meantime, if you have an icebreaker for a future episode for us, leave your question in a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and we'll answer it in a future episode. All right. So I absolutely love vintage clothing, and I've been buying it basically for as long as I've been buying clothing for myself. I just grew up shopping in thrift stores, and later on I became kind of obsessed with dresses from the 40s and the 50s, and I wore those a lot. And even though I don't dress in full-on vintage style these days, I still absolutely get inspiration from garments from the past. And often I think clothing from past decades has really interesting details and fabrics that you just don't see today, or at least not in affordable clothing because it's just too expensive to mass produce. But when you sew, you can learn to incorporate these things back into your clothing and you can get that high-end look. So when it comes to what you put into your wardrobe, Haley, how do you decide whether to buy something secondhand or to make it yourself?
I think that if it's a garment that I want to be straight up vintage, like a kind of copy and paste a style from the past, I'll at least attempt to find it secondhand first, because that's always the most, sustainable thing is to consume what already exists out there.
Yeah.
And I do like to keep, sustainability in mind as I create and build my wardrobe. I'm a big fan of using like apps like Depop, and I'll add those things to my saved searches so that I can just check up on it periodically. And if that proves to be less fruitful, then I'll add it to my sewing queue. What about you? How do you decide?
This is actually something I kind of struggle with a little bit because, well, like you, I think buying secondhand is a very sustainable choice.
Mm-hmm.
But I do notice that it can lead me to overconsume
Mm-hmm.
because there's just so much out there and you can find good deals. Like things don't have to be really expensive when you buy secondhand,
Yeah.
which is partly why I have so much clothing, more than I really need. That's one of the reasons I'm trying to build a wardrobe that's 80% made by me. It's not so much because I think that that's necessarily the more sustainable choice on a piece by piece basis,
Yeah.
but it'll lead me to consume less overall and to have less, to own less that I have to then take care of and manage. That's one of the kind of considerations that's been popping up in my mind lately when it comes to clothing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think that it really is a good question to kind of like pose to yourself is, does secondhand create like a different problem for you? I get really stressed out by belongings.
Yeah.
So I'm not like a really big over consumer. So for me, it's not as much of an issue. But if that is something that is a little bit more of like an issue for you, then I think that's a really interesting way to think about it.
I think my problem is not so much acquiring too much stuff, but I have a really hard time getting rid of things that I like.
Yeah, totally.
If there's a vintage thing in my closet that I think is really pretty, even if I hardly ever wear it, it's hard for me to get rid of.
Okay, so what do you think qualifies as vintage in your mind?
That's a really good question. I feel like these days, in my mind, just off the top of my head, I think of anything maybe the 90s and before as being vintage.
Same.
Which is weird because that's kind of the era that I grew up in as I was a teenager and first started, wearing clothes of my own choosing. So it's kind of funny that that's now vintage, but that's kind of what I think of.
Yeah, we had a model recently. She came in for her first fitting with us and I was, asking her questions about herself. I'd never met her before. And she told me that she sells secondhand clothing, like vintage secondhand clothing. I was like, oh my gosh, so cool. What kind of stuff? And she's like, I'm really into Y2K, early aughts. And I was like, oh, cool. Cool. That's great. I love that for you. How old are you?
I remember when I was a teenager and I went into a bookstore. I was like a chain bookstore, and there was a copy of Sassy magazine there, and I loved Sassy. And I was looking through Sassy, and they had like this editorial that was a retro photo spread of 80s fashion. And this was the 90s. So it was like 10 years before. I was like, how could this be retro? It was just like 10 years ago. I remember thinking that. But of course, now the 80s, we think of it as being such a distinct style period.
Yeah, totally.
But back then, it was kind of bleeding into the style of the time. So it's kind of funny.
That is funny. And I wonder how much our perspectives of what's vintage and what's not will change over the coming years, if there'll be this kind of milestone in our mind that everything before this point is vintage and it kind of stays static. I think for some people, that's how it goes. All right. So do you have a favorite decade of fashion?
I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, and we might even have very similar answers for this. But I have two favorite decades, which are the 1930s and the 1970s for me.
Same.
I love the 1930s. I think I just love bias cuts. I love the sleek lines. I think that is the stuff I love wearing myself, kind of modern interpretations of that. So I absolutely love that era of fashion. And then the 70s, I just think there's just so much fun stuff from the 70s that is, I don't know, I just love it. What about you?
Oh, I'm also a huge fan of the 30s and 70s. I like the 30s because I like shopping details from the 30s. There was a lot of innovation that was happening because people were being more conservative with fabric because of the Great Depression. And so I think that there's lots of really interesting things in the small details of the 1930s. I also think of it as, I think a lot of people think of modern fashion beginning in the 1920s, and there was like a really big shift in silhouettes and undergarments and then hemlines during that time. But for me, the 1930s is like, I think of that as like the more beginning of a more modern era of fashion. And then 70s, I'm just a fan of the vibes, the silhouettes. I find it to be really wearable and easy to incorporate vintage pieces into my wardrobe from that decade in particular.
Yeah. I feel like the 70s, you started to see a lot more tailoring and masculine influences in women's clothing in a way you hadn't necessarily seen before. And I think that appeals to me.
Yeah.
That's part of it.
And I also just like the way those cuts look on my body personally. And it's changed over time, the decades that I've liked, because I don't think I would have answered that question the same 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay, we have lots of good, juicy tips to get into. So I am going to kick us off with our first one, which is looking at online museum collections. If you want to see some really true works of art and fashion, look at collections that you can find online. You can look at places like the V&A and the Met, which are two of our favorites. The Met's Costume Institute has over 33,000 works in its collection online. So you can search for your favorite designer and find hundreds of images. Often there will be descriptions of materials and the techniques that they used as well. So it's a really fun place to kind of nerd out. So take note of any particularly interesting pieces that you fall in love with and how you might incorporate something similar into a garment that you can wear. So for example, I searched the term Dior in the Met's collection and I came across this really glossy black cocktail dress that was double-breasted and it had covered buttons down the front. And it was inspired by a man's tuxedo. And it made me think about how you could use covered buttons on a black dress to create a really similar effect.
The Met just has so much great stuff online. The V&A too. That's the Victoria and Albert Museum if you're not familiar with the V&A. And they have a huge costume collection.
Yeah, it's a really fun resource to look at. And it's nice to be able to look at these images and also have the descriptions available with them as well. A lot of times, if you're just looking at like Google Images, you may not be able to get that same level of information.
Yeah. And textiles too. They have big textile collection at the V&A. That's really inspiring, even just for color, even just to get color inspiration. It'd be really fun to look through. Right. Our second tip is to start a Pinterest board just for vintage details. So if you're starting to find a lot of beautiful ideas on these sites, on these museum sites or other places that you come across, you might want to start a Pinterest board that's just for vintage details. So I started a board like this years ago, and now Pinterest is constantly serving me these beautiful ideas from vintage garments that I wouldn't have come across otherwise. Actually, it was really funny. I was looking at Pinterest yesterday and there was this picture of this beautiful gown, and it said it was like sewing inspiration from Charles James or something like that. And I was like, oh, this looks interesting. I clicked on it. It was a Seamwork article from a long time ago that I forgot about. I was like, wow, this looks really cool.
Right up my alley.
But anyway, I just get so much inspiration coming at me that way. I also have a board specifically for heirloom sewing details, which is something else that I'm really interested in. So if there's a particular style or era that you're really drawn to, having a board for that inspiration can be helpful, because then the algorithm will serve you kind of similar images that can be really inspiring and kind of fit with the aesthetic that you're interested in. And when I'm designing my sewing projects, I always return to these boards and I think about what details that I can include. So, for example, when I was planning my spring sewing, I found all of these beautiful images of smocked gowns from the 40s and 50s, and I ended up incorporating smocking into the Madu top that I'm working on. So I really wanted to learn more about that. So I bought a book on smocking, and I'm going to try out some smocking on one of my projects. I'm really excited about that. Actually, if you want to follow along with that, definitely go to our YouTube channel, because I'll be sharing a video about it once it's done. Do you have Pinterest boards for details like that too, Haley?
Yes. I have a kind of general details board, and then I have individual ones. I like to sort by like application. So I have one for sleeves, I have one for pockets, I have one for collars. And as a designer, I find it really helpful to catalog them that way, because then when I'm designing something and I'm feeling like maybe it's feeling a little uninspired, I can look for inspiration that are specific to design elements that I'm incorporating already. So that's how I like to incorporate it. And I mix my vintage and modern inspiration in those, which is kind of nice to see it amongst all of the modern things. I don't know, for my brain.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good way to organize things. It makes it easy to find the details that you might want to add on to your projects.
Totally. Like this blouse has this like sleeves, but maybe they're feeling like a little bit bleh to me. Then I can go and look and find a bunch of cool different sleeve silhouettes and cuff details and buttons and all the bits and bobs.
Yeah.
All right. Our next tip is to study vintage garments IRL in real life. Nothing really beats getting a good look at a vintage garment up close and personal. And if you really want to understand the construction and the details, this is the best way to do it. So what I like to do is visit some higher end vintage stores, if you have them in your area, and just look at the fabric and the inside of these garments. You'll find some really incredible construction details this way. You can even take a little sketchbook with you and sketch some of the details that you saw after your visit. It can be a fun little date to take yourself on, go vintage shopping and then a coffee shop to do a little sketching. It can be also really interesting to do this in just high-end boutiques with modern clothing as well. Just think of it as shopping for ideas. I used to actually do this all the time when I was in design school because it was one of the assignments that we were often given for our illustration classes so we could get familiar with how to convey certain ideas and details to pattern makers and manufacturers. Do you ever go vintage idea shopping?
Yeah, definitely. I do. Now where I live, I don't have as much opportunity to shop for vintage as I used to, but I love doing it when I can. There's this shop here in Portland. Well, actually, I don't know if I'm sure it's still there, Extabay.
Last time I was in that area, it was.
And it's just, she has such beautiful things. And I used to live near that shop, and I would walk by and just pop in and look at all the gorgeous dresses that she had. It's just such a great way to find details. And especially I like it for looking at the interiors of garments because you can see really how it's constructed up close.
And if you ever feel self-conscious going into stores like this, most of the people who work at those places are just as enthusiastic about vintage and all of the details as you are. And they're happy usually to just be in the presence of someone who also appreciates it.
Yeah, definitely. The next tip is to get some fashion coffee table books. So one of my favorite sources of inspiration are beautiful coffee table books on designers of the past, like Dior. Well, these aren't necessarily designers of only the past, but the books tend to focus on the past, on the history of the design house. Dior, Balenciaga, Yves Saint Laurent. My favorite is a book that I have on L'Envent. I hope I'm saying that right. French is not my first language, obviously. L'Envent, which is just stuffed with gorgeous images across decades of time. And every time I look at it, I see something different. There's just so many beautiful details in there. And if you don't want to spend a fortune on books, you can usually find these at the library, or you can find them used as well. And I just find it so nice to get away from the computer for a little while, pull down a few of these books, and just sit with some tea or some coffee, gathering ideas, sketching, just admiring the beauty from the past. Do you have any favorite fashion books, Haley?
Ooh, I have a Vivienne Westwood book that I really like. I also love looking through vintage sewing technique books for details as well. Sometimes there's small little details that can be really inspiring. Recently, I was looking at one and there was hand-picked patch pockets for outerwear projects. And I found that to be like really inspiring and got me thinking about upcoming designs or projects I have that I could incorporate that detail where it's not necessarily like this huge revolutionary thing, but it gives this really extra special look to the garment that you really don't see in mass manufactured clothing anymore.
Yeah, that's what's so special about vintage, and especially designer vintage, or those things that, well, like we were saying earlier, it's not cheap to produce. So it's not produced as much anymore.
Yeah, I think that sometimes we get this idea that vintage details have to be like very vintagey looking. And sometimes it can be as simple as a sewing technique and at first glance might not be perceived as like vintage, but the inspiration is there.
Yeah.
So if your style isn't very vintagey, then I wouldn't be like thrown off by the word vintage. I think that there's something for everyone in that.
Absolutely. And if you look at designer clothing today, much of the details that you see are inspired by the past.
Totally. Okay. And our last tip is to process your ideas. once you've gathered all of this really amazing inspiration, what are you going to do with it? I feel like a lot of the time we just collect lots and lots of ideas and never actually do much with it. So I invite you to incorporate them into your planning process a little bit. Is there a technique you want to try, or a detail or fabric that you just can't get out of your head? Choose just one of those ideas and see if you can incorporate it into your next seasonal sewing plan. Maybe it'll inspire a totally new project, or maybe you can incorporate it into something you were already planning on sewing. The point is to just use it.
All right. Well, those were our tips today for taking inspiration from vintage and applying it to your modern sewing. So I'm going to recap some of the thoughts we shared with you today. Number one was to look at museum collections online. We mentioned the Met's Costume Institute and the Victoria and Albert Museum as examples that have a lot to choose from. Start a Pinterest board just for vintage details. Study garments, vintage garments in real life to get an even better sense of how they're constructed and ideas for the interiors especially. Get some fashion coffee table books. We mentioned a few that we like, but any designer that you're particularly drawn to can be a rich font of inspiration. And then the final one was to make sure that you process your ideas and you have a way to actually incorporate them back into your planning process and back into your sewing. So what's your big takeaway from today's episode, Haley?
I think that my big takeaway is that it's really important to vary the sources of inspiration that you seek. I think it's really easy to get bored with yourself, bored with your inspiration. Actively seeking ways that go just beyond like a Pinterest search to like enrich your design perspective. It just keeps it fresh. And it also keeps you really motivated in your sewing. If you're just looking at the same old thing and recreating the same old thing over and over again, you're not going to have, I don't want to speak definitively, but you might find that your motivation, that well in you runs dry a little bit faster. So I just encourage you to like get out and about, find inspiration, new places, and especially if you're feeling a little bleh.
Yeah. And also it makes you not just see things in a different way, but I feel like there's a lot of homogeneity today in the way people dress, and a lot of trends and all the algorithms that feed us information and inspiration, I think, can lead to kind of sameness.
Yeah.
And so getting a mix of inspiration can break you out of that. I think my big takeaway was the last tip that we shared, which is to actually use the inspiration.
Yeah.
I feel like lately I've been noticing that I spend a lot more time gathering ideas and inspiration than I do actually using them to create, and I want to change that. So even though I love collecting inspiration, getting ideas, sketching, all that stuff, I want to make sure that I'm actually using it to create and spending my time creating more than I am just gathering. So I think that's a really important part of it, is figuring out how am I going to actually use this. And I think having a planning process and having a way to plan out your projects and make sure that you're going back to the things that inspire you and incorporating them into your creations is really, really important. And at least it is for me. All right. Well, we have a new pattern coming out tomorrow that I want to talk about real quick. It's absolutely perfect for incorporating vintage details, especially if you like those heirloom details that I mentioned, like lace or pin tucks, things like that. And if you want to be the first to get it, make sure you're a Seamwork member so you get access right away, because members get first crack at every new pattern we put out each month, plus access to our entire library of over 250 patterns. We have over 250 patterns, and we have over 100 bonus packs that go with them. So go to seamwork.com/go/podcast if you want to learn more about that. And if you like this episode, please leave us a review. We love seeing your reviews. You can also follow us on YouTube at Seamwork Video. You can follow us on Instagram at Seamwork. And if you'd like to become part of the Seamwork community, head over to seamwork.com/go/podcast to learn how to join. And that's it for us this week. I'm Sari.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the team at Seamwork. Seamwork's an online community that supports you in creating a wardrobe that feels right for you. When you join us at Seamwork, you become part of our private community of makers, and you also get access to monthly sew-along classes, a library of over 200 sewing patterns, and tons of great resources to help guide you through the sewing adventure that you choose. podcast listeners can get half off a Seamwork Unlimited membership, which means you can download as many of those 200 plus patterns as you want at any time, and our community will be there to guide and support you. If you'd like to join us for half off, just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find us on Instagram at Seamwork, or visit our YouTube channel, which is called Seamwork Video. We love hearing from you, so let us know if there's a topic or a personal story that you'd like us to cover. Thanks for listening to Seamwork Radio.